The wind in Chicago does not merely blow, it hunts. The locals, those who have lived their entire lives in the shadow of the steel skyscrapers, call it the Hawk. It waits at the corners of Michigan Avenue and Wacker Drive, sharp and invisible, ready to cut through heavy wool coats and freeze the marrow in your bones. On a Tuesday in late November, the Hawk was particularly cruel, carrying with it the biting moisture of the lake and the promise of a winter that would take no prisoners. Inside the heated, sterile walls of Wacker University's Science Hall, the cold was just a view from the window, a gray backdrop for the privileged students sipping their artisan coffees. But for Marcus Thorne, a 16-year-old black boy trying to make himself small in the back row of Auditorium 304, the cold was a living thing. It resided inside his thin, oversized hoodie, a permanent tenant in his chest, sitting right next to the gnawing hunger that he had learned to ignore. Marcus should not have been there. By the cruel logic of the city, by the statistical probability of the streets, he should have been invisible, huddled under the concrete arch of the I-90 overpass, praying for a few hours of sleep before the police moved him along. But Marcus possessed a mind that refused to be contained by poverty. He had a hunger that the soup kitchens could not feed. He was starving for numbers, for the beautiful, silent order of mathematics in a world that felt chaotic and unfair. He sat in the darkest corner of the lecture hall, pulling his hood down low over his eyes, knowing the risks. If campus security saw him, a teenager in dirty clothes, smelling of wood smoke and rain, in a room full of the city's elite, they wouldn't ask him if he was thirsty. They wouldn't ask him if he was lost. They would just drag him out. Before we unravel this story of deep injustice and the thunderous redemption that followed, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to bringing to life the memories and voices that were silenced, carrying the wisdom of a lifetime that the world tried to forget. Join our community now, like this video, and let's ensure these stories are heard by everyone. Down on the stage, bathed in the warm, golden glow of the theatrical spotlights, paced Professor Alistair Sterling. Sterling was everything Marcus was not. A tall, wealthy man in his 50s with silver hair perfectly coiffed and a bespoke three-piece Italian suit that cost more than Marcus would likely see in a lifetime. He moved with the easy, languid confidence of a man who had never been told no, a man who believed the world was paved specifically for his feet. He was lecturing on advanced theoretical physics and chaos dynamics, a course so difficult it was rumored to break the spirits of doctoral candidates. His voice, amplified by the sound system, dripped with a cultured, practiced condescension. He told the class that mathematics was a dictatorship of logic, not a democracy of opinions, and that, frankly, most of them were merely wasting his oxygen by occupying the seats in his hall. The students chuckled nervously, a sound of submission and fear, terrified of the man rumored to be on the shortlist for the Nobel Prize. Marcus, however, was not listening to the insults. He was not intimidated by the suit or the reputation. He was captivated by the green slate of the blackboard. Sterling was writing a chaotic stream of variables, a complex tapestry of Greek letters and integers that looked like gibberish to the uninitiated, but like a symphony to Marcus. He leaned forward, entranced, his lips moving silently as he calculated the derivatives in real time, faster than the professor could write them. As he shifted his weight to see past the head of a student in front of him, his foot accidentally kicked the plastic bag resting under his chair. It was his only luggage, containing everything he owned in the world. The sound of empty aluminum cans spilling onto the polished concrete floor echoed like a gunshot in a library. Clang, crunch, clatter. The noise seemed to go on forever, bouncing off the acoustic panels of the ceiling. The silence that followed was instant and suffocating. It felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Professor Sterling stopped mid-sentence, his chalk hovering millimeters from the board. He slowly turned around, his eyes narrowing like a predator spotting wounded prey in the tall grass. He scanned the rows of terrified faces until his gaze landed on the back corner. He asked, with a voice that was quiet and deadly, who had made that noise. 300 heads turned in unison. They saw the cans rolling down the steps, glinting under the lights. And then they saw the boy. Marcus froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct he had honed on the street screamed at him to run, to bolt for the door and disappear into the alleyways. But his legs felt like lead. The shame was a physical weight, pressing him into the chair. Sterling began to walk up the stairs of the auditorium. His leather shoes clicked ominously on the steps, a slow, deliberate rhythm that signaled doom. He walked past the rows of MacBooks and designer jackets, the smell of his expensive cologne, sandalwood, and old money wafting ahead of him. He loomed over Marcus, wrinkling his nose as if he smelled something rotting. He looked at the boy's taped-up sneakers, his stained hoodie, his hands rough from scavenging. He asked if Marcus had gotten lost looking for the dumpster, or if he perhaps thought the university was a shelter for delinquents. Laughter rippled through the room. It wasn't the warm laughter of shared amusement. It was cruel, sharp, and exclusive. It was the sound of a wall being built between us and them. Marcus shrank into his seat, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. He whispered, his voice cracking with lack of use, that he just wanted to learn. Sterling threw his head back and laughed, a dry, hollow sound that chilled the room. He mocked the boy, asking the class what a creature like this could possibly learn in a place like this. He told Marcus he was a stain on the institution, a blemish on the sterile environment of academia. He said the only thing someone like him needed to count was pennies for scrap metal or the number of days until he ended up in prison. The humiliation burned Marcus's cheeks and stung his eyes. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was the weight of history. It was the crushing realization that to men like Sterling, Marcus wasn't even a human being. He was just debris. But Sterling, enjoying the rapt attention of his audience, decided that verbal abuse was not enough. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to prove his superiority by crushing this intruder completely. He walked back down to the stage, picked up a fresh piece of chalk, and pointed to the massive empty section of the blackboard. He announced that he was about to introduce the Dvorsky paradox, a fluid dynamics equation that had remained unsolved for 20 years. He said that his own PhD students wept over it, that it was a monster that devoured careers. Then, with a sneer that twisted his handsome face, he challenged the boy. He asked if the savant from the gutters would like to come down and show them the way. It was a cruel, impossible joke, a trap designed to expose Marcus as an illiterate fool. Marcus looked at the exit sign, glowing red in the semi-darkness. Freedom was just a few steps away. He could leave, vanish into the wind, and never come back. But then, he looked at the board. He looked at the preamble of the equation Sterling had started. And suddenly, the fear vanished. The anger vanished. The cold vanished. Because the equation was wrong. It wasn't just difficult. It was fundamentally unbalanced. It was screaming in pain, like a song played out of tune. The variables were fighting each other because the premise was flawed. Marcus stood up. He was thin, malnutrition evident in his gaunt frame, but he stood tall. He walked down the stairs, the sound of his worn sneakers squeaking faintly in the silence. He felt the eyes of 300 strangers on him, eyes filled with pity, disgust, and amusement. When he reached the stage, Sterling held out the chalk with a look of mock generosity. Marcus took it. It felt cool and dry in his hand, a familiar tool. He stepped up to the board, the green expanse looming over him like a mountain. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. In the darkness of his mind, he didn't see the classroom. He saw the damp concrete of the underpass. He saw his mother, Eleanor, huddled under a blanket, holding a flashlight over a stack of old, water-damaged textbooks. He heard her voice, rasping but fierce. "The world is chaos, Marcus. People lie. Systems fail. But numbers? Numbers are holy. If you treat them with respect, they will always tell you the truth." Marcus opened his eyes and began to write. At first, the scratching of the chalk was tentative, a quiet noise in the cavernous room. But then, a rhythm took over. He wasn't just solving the equation, he was dismantling it. He erased Sterling's clumsy variables with the sleeve of his hoodie. He introduced a new theorem, something wild and elegant, blending topology with nonlinear algebra in a way that defied convention. He worked with a feverish intensity, his hand moving faster than his conscious thought. He was in the zone, that rare mental state where time ceases to exist and everything becomes pure clarity. The snickering in the room stopped abruptly. Phones were lowered, postures straightened. The silence shifted from awkward to stunned. Sterling, who had been leaning against his desk checking his watch, looked up. His smug expression faltered, then cracked. He squinted at the board, unable to comprehend what he was seeing at first. Then, as the logic unfolded, his eyes widened. He took a step forward, then another, drawn in against his will. Marcus was moving faster now, dust flying from the chalk, covering his dark clothes in a fine white mist. He was connecting dots that no one had dared to connect before, building a bridge over the mathematical abyss that had stumped the department for decades. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The tension in the room was electric. With a final, decisive stroke that snapped the chalk in two, Marcus drew a box around the final integer. 0. Balance. Perfection. Entropy resolved. He dropped the nub of chalk into the tray and turned around, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The room was dead silent. You could hear the hum of the ventilation system and the distant wail of a siren outside. Sterling's face had drained of all color. He looked like a ghost. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Finally, he stammered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage, asking where the boy had stolen that solution. Marcus looked Sterling in the eye, really looked at him, and saw the small, terrified man hiding behind the expensive suit. He said quietly, "It wasn't stolen. It was corrected." Then, he grabbed his bag of cans, pulled his hood up, and walked out the side door, disappearing into the biting Chicago wind, leaving behind a room of stunned geniuses and a professor whose empire had just developed a fatal crack. The story should have ended there. It should have been a viral moment on TikTok, a homeless kid outsmarts professor clip that people scrolled past after 5 seconds. But the universe has a way of balancing its own equations. Professor Julian Vance, the head of the mathematics department and a man of unshakable integrity, saw the video that evening. He sat in his office, nursing a lukewarm coffee, watching the shaky footage recorded by a student. He didn't look at the boy's clothes or the drama of the confrontation. He looked at the handwriting on the board. He zoomed in on the specific way the Greek letter sigma was drawn, with a sharp, distinctive loop at the top, and the way the integrals were simplified using a shorthand that hadn't been taught in 20 years. Vance dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the hardwood floor, but he didn't flinch. He whispered a name he hadn't spoken in 17 years, Eleanor. He knew that handwriting. He knew that mind. It belonged to Eleanor Thorne, the brightest student he had ever mentored, the woman who was supposed to change the world of mathematics before she was expelled in a scandal that destroyed her life. A scandal orchestrated by Alistair Sterling. Vance grabbed his coat and ran out into the snow. He didn't know where the boy was, but he knew he had to find him. For 2 days, Vance combed the homeless encampments near the south side. He showed a screenshot of Marcus from the video to everyone he met. Shelter volunteers, beat cops, street vendors. Finally, a woman collecting bottles pointed him toward the lower level of Wacker Drive. Vance scrambled down the muddy embankment, slipping on the ice, until he reached the shadows of the overpass. There, he found them. He saw Eleanor, the woman who should have been leading research at CERN or NASA, huddled over a fire made of trash, wrapped in layers of filthy blankets. She looked 20 years older than her age, her face gaunt, her body racked by a deep, rattling cough. Marcus instantly stepped in front of his mother, holding a jagged piece of rusted pipe, his eyes wild with protection. He screamed at Vance to stay back. But Eleanor, squinting through the smoke and the dim light, recognized the man in the coat. She called out his name, her voice weak but steady. In a cheap hotel room paid for by Vance that night, with the heating turned up high and warm food on the table, the truth finally spilled out. It was a story of betrayal that made Vance's blood boil. Eleanor explained that the Sterling constant, the groundbreaking discovery that had made the professor's career and fortune, was actually her thesis. 20 years ago, she had trusted Sterling as her advisor. She had shown him her work, the Helix method, a week before she was due to publish. 2 days later, Sterling had accused her of plagiarism. He claimed she had stolen the work from his private files. He had the money, the lawyers, the tenure, and the reputation. Eleanor had nothing. She was a scholarship student, pregnant with Marcus, and alone. The university expelled her to protect its star professor. She lost her degree, her credibility, and her future. Crushed by the system, unable to get a job with a fraud record, she had slipped through the cracks of society, eventually ending up on the streets. But she had never stopped teaching her son. She had poured all her knowledge into him, her only legacy. Vance revealed that Sterling was currently in damage control mode. The video of Marcus had rattled him. He had called for a disciplinary hearing, demanding that Marcus be banned from campus for vandalism and academic fraud, claiming the boy had memorized a stolen answer key to humiliate him. Vance looked at Marcus and told him the hard truth. If he ran now, Sterling would win forever. He would erase Marcus just like he erased Eleanor. But if Marcus walked into that hearing and proved the math was his, they could bring the tyrant down. Marcus refused at first, shaking his head. He said they would never believe a homeless black kid against a rich white man. He said the game was rigged. Eleanor interrupted him. She reached into the bottom of her battered backpack, the one item she guarded with her life. She pulled out 3 tattered, water-stained spiral notebooks. They were swollen with dampness, but the ink was indelible. They were dated 1998, 1999, and 2000. She told Marcus that they didn't have to believe him. They just had to believe the dates. She had been paranoid back then, terrified of exactly this happening. She had mailed carbon copies of her notes to herself, leaving the postmarked envelopes sealed as proof of timeline. She handed the notebooks to her son and told him to finish what she had started. The dean's conference room was packed the next morning. It wasn't just a hearing, it was a tribunal. The university board was there, the legal team was there, and Alistair Sterling sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. He looked relaxed, joking with the dean, dismissing the whole event as a prank by a street kid looking for internet fame. When the doors swung open and Marcus walked in, followed by Vance and a frail but dignified Eleanor, silence fell over the room. Marcus had showered and wore clean clothes Vance had bought him, but he still wore his old taped-up sneakers, a reminder of where he stood. Sterling slammed his hand on the table, demanding Marcus be arrested for trespassing. Marcus didn't flinch. He walked straight to the digital whiteboard at the front of the room. He picked up the stylus and turned to Sterling. He asked the professor about the famous Sterling Bridge formula, the cornerstone of his career. Sterling, sneering, said it was the standard. Marcus asked why, then, the bridge collapsed at negative integers. Sterling blinked, caught off guard, and stammered that it was a theoretical impossibility. Marcus retorted that it was not impossible, it was inevitable. He began to write furiously on the screen, projecting his calculations for the whole room to see. He explained that Sterling had copied the final result, but had missed the derivation steps on page 42 of the source material. He had missed the Eleanor variable. At the mention of the name, Sterling flinched as if slapped physically. Marcus continued, his voice rising with the passion of a prosecutor. He showed that Sterling had treated a chaotic sequence as a constant because he didn't understand the underlying math. He had stolen the car but never learned how to drive it. Sterling stood up, face turning purple, screaming that these were lies, demanding proof. That was when Professor Vance stepped forward. He dropped the 3 tattered notebooks onto the center of the mahogany table with a heavy thud. He announced that these were the original journals of Eleanor Thorne, postmarked and notarized 3 years before Sterling had published his theory. The dean reached for the first notebook. He opened it. He saw the handwriting. He looked at the screen where Marcus was writing. It was a perfect match. The room erupted in murmurs. The dean looked at Sterling and demanded an explanation. Sterling scrambled, sweat pouring down his face, claiming Eleanor was just an assistant, that the work belonged to him by protocol. Marcus cut him off. He reminded the room that Sterling hadn't just taken the work, he had destroyed the worker. He had expelled her, erased her name, and let her rot in the cold while he drank champagne and collected awards. Marcus dropped the stylus, the sound amplified by the microphone. He looked Sterling in the eye and delivered the final blow. You can steal the work, Professor. You can steal the credit, but you can't kill the math. The math always tells the truth. The empire of Alistair Sterling collapsed in that moment. The police, who had been stationed to escort Marcus out, moved toward the head of the table. Sterling slumped in his chair, the arrogance draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, pathetic old man who knew his life was over. The fallout was swift and brutal. Sterling was fired, stripped of his tenure, and indicted for academic fraud, embezzlement, and perjury. His name was scrubbed from every building on campus. But the real ending, the one that mattered, happened 6 months later. In a small, warm apartment near the university, Eleanor Thorne sat at a sturdy oak desk. She looked healthy, her hair clean and braided. She was writing. Beside her lay a letter from the university board, offering her a fully funded research chair and a formal public apology. Marcus walked in, dropping a new backpack on the sofa. He was enrolled in the university's accelerated doctoral program, recognized as the prodigy he always was. He hugged his mother, burying his face in her shoulder. They were finally home. 10 years later, the same lecture hall was full on a rainy Chicago afternoon. The wind howled outside, but it couldn't touch anyone inside. A young man stood on the stage, wearing a simple sweater and comfortable sneakers. Professor Marcus Thorne. He was writing on the board, teaching the next generation. He stopped and turned to the class, telling them that the most important thing in mathematics was not the answer, but the honesty of the question. As he spoke, he noticed the back door crack open. A young girl, soaked from the rain, holding a plastic bag of belongings, peeked in. She looked terrified, ready to bolt. Marcus smiled. He saw himself in her eyes. He put down the chalk and walked up the stairs. He invited her in, telling her not to worry about the mud or her clothes. He gestured to the front row, to a seat right in the center. He told her there was a seat for her, always. Because he knew that sometimes the only way to solve the equation of injustice is to change the variables for the next generation. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below telling us what is the biggest injustice you've ever overcome. We want to hear your story. Until next time.